In early spring of 2024, I booked an appointment with my local dermatologist to figure out why bumps and marks suddenly appeared on my fingers. I was told I have dyshidrotic eczema. Nothing serious or contagious, but something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. While I was relieved to learn that what I thought was Google-itis, the worst possible condition your symptoms match on Google, was actually a mundane cosmetic condition, I was very confused. After all, the first 18 years of my life was without it. So, why do I have eczema now? And where did it come from? After I came home and talked with my grandma about the diagnosis, she wasn't surprised. She has eczema, and apparently my grandfather did too. By her own words, it runs in the family. Black people are all too familiar with that phrase. Seemingly everything from cancer, heart disease, high blood pressure, and asthma. Every and any health condition runs in our families. But why? When did these medical conditions begin to run in our family, and why our families? To understand what that phrase really means, we have to look to the past. Welcome. I'm the librarian, and you are listening to the Garden Library. This is a blogcast that tackles a variety of topics with a skew towards climate and environmental policy. This is Lesson 1 of the Black History Month special, Living History and Forgotten Truths. Today's lesson is on environmental racism. The institution of slavery in America is without a doubt the most impactful event in understanding the history and present life of African Americans. However, for today, I can largely skip over this aspect of the discussion. Not because it's small or unimportant, but because what happened after, and the context of medical conditions, has remained shrouded in mystery and confusion. So, while I will return to this topic at a later date, for right now, our history lesson takes us to the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, with the rise of segregation, Jim Crow, and racism. Segregation as the systemic divorce of black and white in many ways changed the way America saw land. If you ever wondered how the very white people who carried out the brutality of slavery and the commodification of black and brown people seemed to not care about living on large-scale plantations constantly in and around black people, it's because, underneath slavery, white America didn't care about blacks living with and around them if blacks had no rights and were beneath white people. Conceptually, slavery saw black people as cows, chicken, and horses. Seen in this way, slave owners were just farmers who were unbothered by the presence of their cattle. To note, though, this cattle mindset was so extreme that white people were unsatisfied with black people existing anywhere on earth, at or above white people's social standing, which amounted to vile kidnappings of northern free black people, the continued enslavement of Africans, among various other forms of bondage. Segregation, though, was different. Originating in the northeastern urban metropolises of Boston and New York during the 1800s, white people didn't care how African Americans went about their life. They can go to school, work in factories, get paid. But white people wouldn't be caught dead near anything black. They didn't want to be in a black bathroom, a black sink, or a black coffee shop. Conceptually, it was as if white people had snapped black people from the earth, Thanos style. It was this mindset that was a driving force behind the creation of Liberia. To segregationists, now that black people were free from southern slavers, America should just ship them away to somewhere in Africa where northerners and white people didn't have to see them, interact with them, or know they exist. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, it was this that became the defining racial policy position for the United States, which was put on display with the practice of redlining. All right, picture this. The year is 1939. The United States has managed to survive the Great Depression, where everybody went broke. And now the United States is sure as hell eager to make sure they never go broke again. One idea they have is to evaluate neighborhoods based on how risky they are for mortgage lending. In essence, they wanted to crack down on giving money to just anyone and create an actual thought process behind what areas banks should loan people money to buy a house for. The government, at least on paper, was trying to make sure that loans eventually get paid off. In Cleveland, Ohio, the neighborhood of Fairfax was being graded by the Home Owners Loan Corporation, HOLC. Now, Fairfax was a community with an over 55% black population, but aside from that fact, it was nothing out of the ordinary. People had jobs, people had businesses. It was an average American town. Now, what do you think HOLC graded the neighborhood as? Well, to quote their own report, due to the detrimental change of ownership occupancy from white to colored and strong colored infiltration, Fairfax was a hazardous community. HOLC gave the neighborhood a D grade based on nothing but its increasingly majority black population. To showcase the extreme risk of this neighborhood, this D grade was identified by a big red stain on a map. This practice has come to be known as redlining, where almost exclusively black and brown communities were redlined as bad locations for mortgage lending. With mortgage lending in black communities heavily disincentivized, seen as outright financial suicide to the banking bigwigs of the day, black people found it increasingly harder to move elsewhere. But before we continue, you should know what happened to black people after slavery ended. In the decades after the 14th Amendment, many black Americans still lived in the South. Unfortunately, so did their former enslavers, who remained staunchly against the mindset of segregation. So, to rectify a reality where they saw black people at and above the level of white people, we saw a rapid rise in lynching, murder, and brutality, something that we'll return to in later days. For black Americans now free, they wanted to escape the brutal specter of slavery, and so millions very quickly moved to the hustle and bustle of urban cities, largely in the North and expanding West. Cities were seen as a much safer option, as the aforementioned Northerners put no thought into black life, as long as they were over there. Cities, for many, were the safest and most logical place to be, and for the few black people that had alternative options, redlining was such a drain on property value and worth that they were now financially trapped in the concrete jungle. And a concrete jungle it was. Redlining chained black people to the poverty of low-value housing. These very low-balled neighborhoods were now not just racial enclaves to escape the KKK, but the only place black people could afford to stay, with generations after being born within those red lines with no feasible way out. Redlining from 1939 to 1970 caused unrecoverable harm to black communities. Low property values meant less money going to fund public schools and amounted to the divestment of predominantly black education. Low property values meant less money to fund infrastructure. Worse infrastructure meant more risk for business. Less business meant less money. And less money meant people could only afford less essentials. And less essentials like food and lower quality education meant rapidly more crime. And more crime meant more policing and more jail, which condemned families to lose out on all that generational wealth white people accrued in suburbia. But most notably, this chain of degradation meant the widespread buildup of environmental hazards. To expand on that point, consider what are environmental hazards. Historically, lead paint, mold, air pollution, poor drainage, lack of food, and unsafe infrastructure come first to mind. All of these hazards can send you to an early grave, from COPD to lung cancer to physical trauma and brain damage. and yet all can be tackled by improving and changing the built environment. Lead paint being banned in construction, building adequate ventilation and exterminating mold where found, reducing local air pollutants, improving sewer infrastructure, even building more supermarkets. But these very changes to the built environment were made impossible in black communities under redlining. Without the aforementioned investment into their neighborhoods and being placed on what essentially was a financial blacklist, no pun intended, black communities were condemned to constant degradation and underfunding. And it was black health being harmed in the process. Okay, we've established the origins of black health, at least black health issues. But what of the state of it today? To answer that, I turn to sociology. W.E.B. Du Bois and his work, The Philadelphia Negro, really began to highlight the deteriorated state of black health was a symptom of racial inequality. Over 126 years later, this work has been further researched and established through the hard work of sociologists. Two such sociologists, David R. Williams and Michelle Sternthal, in 2012 published an article entitled Understanding Racial and Ethnic Disparities in Health: Sociological Contributions. While that article and study was filled to the brim with analysis and important context on much discussed here today, there was one particular section of note, that of the interplay of race and class. Black and brown people who live in the hood experience the intersection of socioeconomic status and race when it comes to their health risks. Not only do black people experience how historical racial inequality impacts their ancestry and modern health outcomes, but their current poverty relative to white people is itself adding an element of challenge. This uniquely doubled health risk is of note when factoring in the financial suffocation redlining caused the black community. Do not be fooled. Though banned on paper in 1970, the impacts of redlining are very much still alive. As the average black neighborhood in urban cities in America as recently as 1995 was still below the worst context a white individual would live within in that same city. In the present day, black and brown homeowners in Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, and New York, just to name a few, have all been given lowballed appraisals for their homes, while their white neighbors, or even white friends pretending to be them, the homeowner, for the appraisal, can see over a $500,000 increase in their evaluation. The socioeconomic impact of redlining has never been undone. Black and brown communities are still underfunded, still undervalued, and still under-resourced today. And boy, oh boy, does that cause a lot of stress. Remember my eczema diagnosis? Well, my dermatologist asked if I had been experiencing any stress at the time of the diagnosis. While a college student, stress is nothing new, but particularly at this time, my family was figuring out how to pay for my semester tuition. My black household is complicated, but at the time, repairs on our deteriorating house and medical bills really drained our cash pool. That stress, the uncertainty of my scholarship, mixed in with some others, resulted in eczema flaring up for the first time in my life. For many black people living with chronic conditions, severe or mild, the biggest factor in their health outcomes is born out of emotion. By far the most impactful emotion, stress, is commonplace in our communities from the very CVS receipt list worth of hazards and issues we face. The stresses, black people's race, and as sociologists have pointed out, their class, manifest in the severity of, as in my case, worsening of chronic conditions, but also the mental health crisis. To touch upon just one example, a study from back in 2017 of 365 college students, 18 to 24, 96% of which were African Americans, found that police brutality, community violence, and unstable housing were some of their biggest stresses. Alongside that, they noted feelings of constant threat, fear, hopelessness, and perceivably low economic opportunity. All of which being factors caused, if not heavily influenced, by historical redlining, which is an important health statistic considering suicide is the third leading cause of death for black people under the age of 24. One of the tenets of the medical field is to first do no harm. It's a Greek phrase of the Hippocratic Oath. But as black and brown Americans have found, the very medical textbooks many of their physicians use rely upon racial stereotypes. And there's no black medical stereotype quite like the myth of pain tolerance. In 1789, Dr. Benjamin Moseley published his manual, A Treatise on Tropical Diseases, on Military Operations, and on the Climate of the West Indies. In it, he went to great lengths detailing his belief that black people made perfect test subjects due to their high pain tolerance. To quote, "They bear surgical operations much better than white people, and what would be the cause of insupportable pain to a white man, a Negro would almost disregard. I have amputated the legs of many Negroes, who have held the upper part of their limb themselves." This particular perspective led to some of the most gruesome medical malpractices in history. J. Marion Sims, a physician heralded by forefathers of modern-day gynecology, honed his surgical skills by experimenting on enslaved black people. In his book, The Story of My Life, Sims goes into much greater depth, and I find the final remarks written by Dr. W. W. Johnston the most horrifyingly mundane description of mutilation and torture I have ever read. To quote, "Even slavery had its uses in the pursuit of his ends. Who can tell how many more years the progress of the art might have been delayed, if the humble Negro servitors had not brought their willing sufferings and patient endurance to aid in the furthering of Sim's purpose." And unfortunately, the horrors didn't end there. Dr. Thomas Hamilton in 1820 conducted various unethical medical experiments on an enslaved person by the name of John Brown, no relation to the famous John Brown. Dr. Hamilton was a physician who dedicated himself to the physiological differences between blacks and whites, and used John Brown as a lab rat to the extent of his ideas. This resulted in Dr. Hamilton intentionally blistering Brown to determine the depth of his skin, a medical misconception used to justify the pain tolerance myth. I give you these few historical examples, and omitted many of which that I couldn't fit in here today, because it was these very physicians and medical forefathers who penned and inspired the medical texts and knowledge of today, which is plenty of explanation for the current racial inequality in healthcare. A 2016 study attempted to determine how prevalent myths about black people's pain tolerance were and how they influenced treatment. To quote, "Half of a sample of white medical students and residents endorsed these beliefs. Moreover, participants who endorsed these beliefs rated the black versus white patient's pain as lower and made less accurate treatment recommendations. These less accurate treatment recommendations amounts to black mothers being denied medication during pregnancy, black youth having their symptoms downplayed by physicians, and an overall reduced likelihood of positive healthcare outcomes, which again is a huge factor in understanding why so many conditions that can be cured or treated or at least kept from worsening propagate in the black community. Black health for centuries has been sacrificed to further the bigotry of racism. As health conditions met at the crossroads of environmental hazards, the black community has contracted a generational illness that will never fade. In coming to understand the foundation of this illness through history and modern manifestations, can we adequately account for the truth of what it is. The forgotten truth is that what runs in black families are the medical wounds of racial discrimination, wounds that bleed as poverty, hopelessness, struggle, and stress, wounds that the white community has largely overlooked, misunderstood, and actually worsened from a lack of cultural competency in medicine and policy.